What's up, everybody? Thralls here once again. I'm Necrotic Nick, and I have yet another album review for you. Again, a lot of stuff that was coming out towards the end of September, but this one is special because this actually came out on October 1st. So this is how October kicks off, and it kicks off with something very appropriate for this month. So we are going to go over the latest offering from Acid Witch, Rot Among Us. This again comes out on October 1st, not September 30th, on Hell's Headbangers Records. This band formed in 2007 in Detroit. I've been a fan since their second album, Stoned. This is their fourth album overall, features members of Temple of Void and Shitfucker, which is such a great name for a band. And this is, oh god, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting combo of things. This is stoner metal, doom metal, a bit of death metal, and horror synths. I don't know. This is literally the perfect thing to kick off October. I will totally stand by that statement. I've been a fan of this band, again, for a number of years, and it's mainly because of their over-the-top, self-aware, sort of horror themes and atmosphere. This is sort of a Detroit staple, at least in my mind, in terms of just weird underground bands. You have to check them out. I still have yet to see them live, but I'm going to get my chance eventually. So I honestly didn't know this was coming out. This kind of completely caught me off guard, but this is literally the perfect month for an Acid Witch album. So I was really eager to get into this, mainly because this does kick off October. And honestly, every Acid Witch album has been a ton of fun so far to actually just kind of immerse myself in, because they kind of just, again, take that sort of horror camp and kind of focus it into riffs and just kind of goofy songs that are self-aware and ridiculous, and it's all done really well. The opening track, Gather Each Witch, perfect setup. Opens up with horror synths, which horror synths are all over here. Slasher Dave loves his horror synths and does a great fucking job with it. This album is loaded with atmosphere, but it kind of sets it up with creepy vocals and this kind of almost Skinny Puppy-ish Tales from the Crypt sort of vibe. Like, it's a very interesting sort of balance between the two, because you have these spoken word or growled word or witch vocals. The vocal dynamics in here are pretty wild, but it sets up the whole mood and the atmosphere, and this intro actually turns into like a cool riffy song. It just kind of switches up into like some big kind of Black Sabbath-y sort of like groovy stomp to it with a good chuggy riff behind it, and just chants the song title. And it's pretty much a good calling to everyone out there. Say, yes, Acid Witch has released another album. You're about to have a lot of fun. And that goes right into the title track, which this is a good example of the bulk of this album. You have a lot of just heavy stoner doom riffs, lots of like Trouble, Pentagram, St. Vitus, or if you want to get something more modern and more like sludge oriented, I would say Down or Crowbar. The riffs are thick, they're chunky, they're very old school, and you have this giant immersive atmosphere with all these synths and weird vocals on here, which vocal dynamics are great. It's not just Slasher Dave. I believe guitarist Magic Mike Huff, who is also in Temple of Void, supplies a lot of vocals too, and there is just this interesting bouncing back and forth. And this is kind of a cool thing because a lot of this is very story driven. Like, there's a story to each song, whether that story is about some, you know, horror movie or like a particular scene in a horror movie, or actual urban legends around Detroit, which you do get a fair amount of that. They're very engaging. Like, you kind of want to know what's going on. The first single I heard was 5508 Martin Street, which I had no idea what the hell it was about. But, you know, listening to the lyrics, they kept bringing up the horror hag. So I actually looked it up, and apparently it's about like an eyewitness haunting back in 1962 in Detroit. A couple went into an abandoned house and witnessed the horror hag, like this scraggly gray-haired woman. She might have been a squatter or something like that. They say it was a ghost. I don't know. I don't believe in ghosts and any of that shit, but it's a very interesting story, and I guess it's sort of part of like a Detroit urban legend. And Devil's Night Doom is literally about Devil's Night, which, I mean, it's pretty much an arsonist's buffet if you're in Detroit. I mean, they kind of crack down on that, but every year on Devil's Night, which is October 30th, there used to be a ton of fires, and this is pretty much about that, just in sort of a comical sense, like let everything fucking burn. There's enough abandoned buildings in Detroit. I mean, I feel like they're kind of, you know, doing the city a favor by, well, not necessarily knocking them down, but at least making them easier to knock down. But musically, this is very catchy and very hooky and very campy. And with the weird over-the-top vocals, like they're growled. You have what I would call witch vocals, because it sounds like Slasher Dave is actually like playing a character on here where narrates part of the story in a very witchy voice, like just think like Wicked Witch of the West, except with laryngitis or throat cancer. And I don't know, it just adds a lot of fun to it, and I kind of like the whole vocal switch-ups on here because it keeps it very interesting. The songs themselves are, you know, very much rooted again in like kind of classic doom with some like occasional death metal heaviness and even a thrashy spot here and there, but a lot of it just feels very classic, like very 70s, early 80s, and there's surprisingly a lot of melody to them, like especially when it comes down to the leads on here. The leads are very bluesy, kind of like Tony Iommi-ish, which, I mean, that totally fits the entire vibe too. But honestly, fun is like kind of the whole thing in this. This sort of embraces the whole campy, over-the-top nature of like 80s horror and just gore and everything Halloween and spooky, and I fucking love that. Now the album has a really interesting flow to it. Like it starts off kind of, you know, partyish. Like there's a lot of that Sabbath swing in a lot of these songs, especially Devil's Night Doom and Psychodethic Swamp Gnosis, which I don't know if that's a condition anyone suffers from, but it sounds actually kind of cool. And the really awesome Sabbathy grooves on The Sleeper, which is like one of my favorite tracks on here. But as the album goes on, it slowly starts to get like more dark and sinister. Like once you get to 5508 Martin Street, there is a bit of a tonal shift, and honestly, like listening to that song, it sounds like the Stoner Doom version of a Macabre song. And those two definitely have some like comparable attributes in terms of like vocal delivery and sort of how the songs flow. Like they're less weird and avant-garde as Macabre, but vocally I think they're very comparable, where it's definitely harsh, but it's also kind of comical and not meant to be taken like seriously. But when you get down to songs like Evil Dad, Dad by Dawn, which I fucking love that play on words, or Chelsea Didn't Come Home Last Night, it's notably more dark and more sinister. Like sort of the whole party boogie aspect is starting to leave, and then it just starts to get more drenched in atmosphere, and the riffs themselves get more dark and heavy. There are thrashy sections in Evil Dad that kind of just come out of nowhere, because most of this is a very mid-tempo sort of like Stoner Doom pace. All of a sudden you get like a thrashy D beat that comes out and it kind of spices it up for just a second. And Chelsea Didn't Come Home Last Night actually has some flat out like death metal riffing and like a nice double bass section. But riff wise, again, it doesn't have like kind of that Sabbathy swing anymore. It kind of turns into more like a flat out death doom band. There's like some distant riffs in there. And I think towards the end is where the synths really start coming alive. It opens very synth driven with Gather Each Witch, but they slowly kind of start sitting more in the back and just like added for an extra bit of atmosphere towards the end of the songs, or maybe just popping up in the middle. But when you get down to songs like Tommy Rotters, which that's also very clever, and Gundella the Green Witch, the synths start, you know, coming out a little bit more. They start being put more in the forefront and adding a lot of that goblin-esque atmosphere to it. And the synth playing on here, I think, is quite a standout. Slasher Dave's always been really good about, you know, adding atmosphere to songs, but it's how he does it, I think, that's really interesting, because he kind of just does what I think each song calls for. Like there's lots of playful synths where they're kind of like bouncy. They kind of sound like, you know, Deep Purple, like Hammond organ stuff. There's some of them that sound like church organs. And then there's just flat out droning, evil horror synths on here. And whatever he's doing, it really just adds to the song and adds more like sort of a fun nature to it, but it also adds like this creepy wave of atmosphere. And you do get like a few samples here and there, but for the most part, the atmosphere is solely on all these synths, and they do a great fucking job with it. And whatever you feel you're missing in terms of atmosphere done by the synths, the vocals, again, make up for it. Especially in Gundella, they start taking the twisted Evil Dead sort of vocals, where it has that twisted distortion the Deadites always speak with. Again, another thing that sort of adds a lot and contributes to the mood of this entire album. And I have to say, like, the entire thing flows really well. You know, both lyrically, thematically, musically. It has this really sort of complete feel overall. And the entire thing is, again, surprisingly catchy for what it is, because this is still gross, this is still heavy, this is still just doomy and ugly, but again, it's surprisingly hooky, and the entire time you're listening to this, you should be having fun, because I know the band was having a ton of fun putting this together. As far as any complaints about this, it's kind of hard to pick them. Like, I think the production here is excellent, which Slasher Dave did that. The guitars sound particularly crunchy and bitey. The drums sound really good. I will say, like, maybe they kind of, you know, overuse very similar riffs, but the riffs kind of like drive the song, but they're not the standout. It's kind of the vocals and the synths on top of that, and kind of all that coming together in this sort of uniform piece. So there really isn't like a weak point that I could point out, other than I would say this sounds like an Acid Witch album, which is awesome in my book. But I mean, there isn't much change from the last one or the one before that, but honestly, it's a band that I don't want to change, because they kind of occupy this really unique space within doom and stoner and death metal. Like, it's kind of all that meeting up and having a few beers and talking about horror movies. That sounds like a good fucking time. So overall, I'm gonna give this 4 stars. This fucking rocked. This is exactly how I want October to kick off, and hopefully it ends with some absolutely awesome releases over the Halloween weekend too. The riff work, again, solid, very Sabbathy, like lots of just good hooky stoner doom riffs, but you also get some thrash metal and death metal in there. Just sort of like little snippets to add some spice to the album. Synth work is fucking amazing on here. The atmosphere just really drives this and makes the album very engaging and fun. I love the references to just like Detroit urban legends and Detroit holidays, because I'm pretty sure Devil's Night is pretty much a Detroit holiday. This is literally the perfect album to accompany a horror movie binge all fucking month long for October, unless you already started in September like I did. If you're an Acid Witch fan, flat out, you're probably gonna love this. You should. If you're not an Acid Witch fan, again, you know, I said this a lot, probably won't win you over, but I still recommend giving it a chance. This is spooky season. You need some fucking spooky music, and this is that. Check this out. It is a fun fucking album, and of course, again, watch a ton of horror movies, because this is that time. So, if you enjoyed this review, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new to the channel, subscribe, because we do stuff like this all the time. We are also on Patreon. If you'd like to help us out there, there's a link down below to thrallsmetal.com. Our Patreon is linked there. And while you're on thrallsmetal.com, you can actually check out our, you know, audio episodes there, so you don't have to look at us, which probably for the best. And we actually have shirts there. We will eventually be getting some new merch. Maybe grenades. I don't know. There's no one here to tell me no right now, so grenades. How about them, right? I'm 70% sure that I'm joking about that. Anyway, last but not least, thank you to everyone that has liked, subscribed, followed, all that shit. We fucking love doing this, and you guys just keep coming back, and it's fucking amazing. We love just this whole community we've built, and the fact that I get to do an awkward thank you after every fucking video, and hopefully people are still watching at this point. I'm really sure there's probably some people like, here comes the fucking thank you part. We can just turn off the video. They got their fucking view. But no, seriously, I appreciate every last bit of this. This has been one of the coolest things I think I've done in my life, which kind of says a lot about me. Like, that's the most positive way for me to say that I might just be a giant loser in his basement. But still, I'm having a ball, and I'm glad you guys are too. So thank you very much once again, and we will catch you later.